The wait is finally over. The best time of the year, March Madness, is finally here. And I just got to say, it feels awesome. Selection Sunday just happened, brackets just got released, and I wanted to break down a few reactions to the bracket on the outset. Wanted to cover the top four seeds, wanted to look at an interesting thing with the SEC, a record breaking number of teams who made the tournament. An interesting addition on the last four in, a couple of overseeds, and kind of an interesting way that the Big Ten shook out. I'm so excited. It is, I said it before, it is probably the best sporting event of the year. Now, I love the Super Bowl, don't get me wrong. Super Bowl is probably the greatest single game that gets played. The pageantry of the Super Bowl is awesome. But the way that March Madness unfolds, especially with the first two rounds, it is just so much excitement, so much energy in just one game. And then you play out 32 some odd games in round one. And then you play more games round two right after that. So it's just such a fun time of year. I love hosting brackets. I get a couple brackets going with a few different groups of friends. And I'm just so excited for the madness to be back. So let's dive in, talk about these top seeds, and then just a few other reactions from the field of 68 overall. So first overall team is Auburn, and that makes a lot of sense. They kind of stumbled in the last bit of the season. That's definitely been a talking point over Selection Sunday. Losing 3 out of 4, losing in the semifinals of the SEC tournament. Is Auburn playing their best basketball? Truth be told, probably not. But when your losses come to Florida and Alabama and Tennessee, who are a respective 1 seed and a couple of 2 seeds, that's not the biggest blemish. And we'll talk about the SEC in a little bit. I think by playing in such a stacked conference, the committee still felt Auburn was the number 1 overall team. And quite frankly, I agree with that. The way that the conference shook out this year, I don't know how it happened. Suddenly, all these Southern schools seem to be getting really good at basketball. But I think it adds a pretty cool dynamic element to March Madness. And we saw that with some of the teams that actually got accepted into the tournament that received bids. But again, we'll cover the SEC in just a little bit. Number 2 overall, Duke, is another number 1 seed coming out of, the East bracket. And makes sense. There were talks about Duke being the number 1 overall team. I think as well, Duke has been dominant, but by playing in a worse conference, for sure, that probably stopped them from getting the number 1 overall seed. Now, there's a little bit of a health concern with Cooper Flagg, all-star freshman, likely one and done at Duke. I believe it might have been in the ACC tournament. There was a weird jump, and he landed really strangely on his ankle. It sounded like he's going to be available for the tournament. Maybe not quite available in round 1, but we did see Duke still run through the tournament, the conference tournament rather, without him. So not too much worry on Duke's part. And if fully healthy, they are easily a Final Four potential team. The next number one overall, Houston. No surprises there whatsoever. I want to say Houston under Calvin Sampson. I think it is 11 straight years with 20 plus wins. They are a model of consistency. Not only has the defense been extremely sharp as it usually is, but their offense has been popping off lately. And if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to check the exact number, but they were a top 20 3-point shooting team. And if you can get a defense that averages allowing, I think it was 56 or 57 points per game allowed, and combined with pretty dynamic sharpshooting, Houston has a path. Granted, there's some tough potential obstacles, which we'll cover a little bit later when we look at matchups, but Houston definitely has a path. Last number one is Florida, and I've been able to catch a fair amount of Florida Gators basketball games, and it doesn't look like anyone's hotter in the entire field. Florida has been on a run over the last 10 some odd, 12 some odd games. They beat Auburn a couple of times. They've been tearing through the SEC. I don't think they've lost a game since early February. This team is incredibly talented, and it doesn't look like they have a whole lot of weaknesses in their game. Now, the thing is with Florida in the West, they have a very difficult road. Now, it's possible they can make it, but it's going to be a tough road for the last number one overall seed. Now, because Florida was able to run through the SEC tournament, they were able to snag that last number one spot. But interestingly enough, leading up to it, Tennessee and Alabama had opportunities to snag that last spot. And it's just incredible how potent and deep the SEC has been this year. Two of the top number one seeds are from the SEC, Auburn and Florida. Then you have a few number two seeds in Alabama, Tennessee. Then let's just double check because it's a long list. We have Kentucky as a 3 seed, Texas A&M as a 4, Ole Miss 6, Missouri 6, Oklahoma 9, which I feel pretty happy calling Oklahoma, and turns out they made it off the bubble. Arkansas 10, Georgia 9, another 9 seed, Arkansas 10, Vanderbilt 10, and Texas made it as a first 4, and they're going to be playing Xavier coming up soon. That is a lot. 14 teams coming in is insane. I did see that the record previously was the 2011 Big East with 11 teams. So the fact that 14 made it into the field is incredible. And I think it's very much warranted, even though teams like Oklahoma, they went 6-12 in conference. Not a great record if you want to make the tournament, but when your conference is so difficult, some teams are going to have to lose more games than they win. And there were plenty of teams like that with Texas, with Oklahoma. I'm pretty sure Vanderbilt had a losing record in conference. But again, when you're playing the likes of this year's Auburn, Florida, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Ole Miss, Mississippi State. I might have missed Mississippi State on the long list, but they still made it in. When you're playing that kind of competition, the committee is going to value that a lot more. Where, say, if you're playing in a far weaker conference, that record is not going to get you into the tournament whatsoever. And it just goes to show that by playing in such a tough conference, you can still trip up a bit and make it into the dance. And if I'm not mistaken, Texas was 19 and 15. So almost 500 overall record. Yet they still get they get a chance to play in to the field. And if I'm not mistaken, that is Texas Xavier, and the winner will go on to play Illinois, which I've seen enough Illinois games. They could play like a Final Four team some weeks and then play like they don't belong in the tournament. So could Texas have a shot to actually win in advance? It's possible. And I think that is kind of a cool thing to see. Now, by getting such a deep conference, you see a lot of teams who you wouldn't normally get into the tournament on any given year. And it just shows a pretty interesting trend. Is SEC basketball going to be one of the new powerhouse conferences? We had really dominant runs from Big East. Could the SEC be starting to make a stamp? In particular, SEC outside of Kentucky, outside of a few one-off years from Auburn or Florida or LSU. So is this new conference going to stay? We'll find out. North Carolina is a team that was on the bubble coming into conference tournaments. And it was a bit of a shocker, truth be told, to see them get picked as one of the first four. They beat out teams like West Virginia, Boise State, Indiana, and left a lot of people scratching their heads asking questions. And rightfully so. They really had a rocky season. Not a terrible win-loss record. They went 22 and 13. Not awful. 13 and 7 in conference. Pretty good. The biggest demerit for sure is got to be their quad 1 record, which is a pretty pitiful 1 and 12. Pretty pitiful for sure. And gotta give North Carolina credit because they scheduled a lot of very difficult opponents early in the season. Granted, that caused them to trip up a lot. But as we saw with the SEC and the strength of schedule and competition you play, the committee rewards that. They reward you for playing difficult competition. And just looking back at their games that they played pretty tough squads when Kansas was ranked number 1. Auburn was ranked number 4. Michigan State wasn't ranked at the time, but that loss aged well as the season went on. Number 10, Alabama. Number 7, Florida. They lost to Louisville, who also made the tournament. They lost to Duke 3 times, which you hope you could avoid losing to your rival 3 times in one season, but considering it's Duke 2025 and they're a number 1 seed, it's hard to blame North Carolina. Now, again, with the quad 1 win-loss record, it doesn't bode very well. I, truth be told, don't know what the committee exactly looks for when they consider bubble teams. It seems like they're placing a lot of emphasis on the strength of schedule and quality of opponents that you play. Because when you go 1 and 12 in quad 1, you would imagine that this is a bottom feeder of a conference. But North Carolina does have a lot of upperclassmen talent. They have the likes of R.J. Davis, who, if I remember correctly, I think is the leading scorer in UNC history, which, considering North Carolina basketball, it's a pretty impressive record to have. They have pretty good senior and junior level players. How far could they go is a big question. Whoever emerges from North Carolina, San Diego State will go on to play Ole Miss, who's a 6 seed. And that's a beatable team, Ole Miss. They are really streaky, especially when it comes to scoring and shooting deep. If North Carolina can get hot against San Diego State, if they happen to win and move on, there's no reason to doubt that they could make noise against Ole Miss. I think that's a winnable game. Now, what does that mean for bubble teams going forward? What's going to be more important? To have a better win-loss record, have a better conference record, or schedule more difficult games, and maybe you could still go above 500 barely and still make it? It's hard to say. But North Carolina's going to have a lot to prove, and they're going to have a lot of doubters, needless to say. So that's going to be interesting to see how their play-in game goes. So I wanted to preface by saying that this season, the Big Ten was strange, to say the least. At least it felt stranger than it normally does. And fewer teams in the Big Ten actually made it to the dance this year. We only had Michigan State, Maryland, Michigan, Purdue, UCLA, Wisconsin, Illinois, Oregon. So actually 8 teams, not terrible. We had some teams who've made it in the past, like Iowa, Rutgers, Indiana, Ohio State, who just kind of fell off, had inconsistent years. Indiana, actually being a bubble team, had some considerations to get in as one of those last 4, but 4-13 in quad 1 is not going to get the job done. Doesn't matter who you are or your pedigree. It did feel for sure that the Big Ten seeding got strange. Now, Michigan State got a 2 seed. Understandable. They were pretty dominant all year, but not quite dominant enough to be a number 1 seed. Michigan State has an issue with shooting from deep. They rely so much on paint points and crashing the glass that if you could just turn it into a 3-point contest, your odds are pretty good against Michigan State. But the weird spot was kind of in the strange seeding of the other Big Ten teams. It felt almost like the committee just mailed in their selections before the conference tournament even began and just called it a day. I did find it strange that Michigan went on a tear in the Big Ten tournament. They pummeled Purdue. They pummeled Wisconsin. Won the Big Ten. And get a 5 seed and a pretty bad draw at a 5 seed too against a team we can go more in depth later on in UC San Diego. That's starting to become a bit of a trendy upset pick. So Michigan gets in as a 5, and I can understand a bit of a rockier season. Recent form would suggest that they probably could have been a 4 potentially. I'm not advocating for them to be a 3 or a 2. Of course not. But the fact that Wisconsin got in as a 3 seed feels a little bit rich. And as well, Purdue, my Boilermakers, boiler up. Purdue getting a 4 seed was quite frankly surprising. And it's good. I like that Purdue got a nice draw. I think Purdue has a pretty good shot against the 13 High Point. I don't think they can overcome Purdue's glaring weaknesses, but it was strange that given recent form, where Purdue lost 4 games in a row, then they lost to Illinois, And then they got the doors beat off them by Michigan in the Big Ten tournament, losing 6 of the last 9 games. Not a great look. And especially when they were just routinely beaten in the paint. Now, I could rant about Purdue for a long time, and maybe that warrants another video. If anyone on the internet wants to hear me ramble about a college basketball team for a long period of time. But it just felt strange that the seeding occurred as it did, despite recent form. Now, truth be told, Purdue had a lot of good early season wins. They beat Alabama, they beat Ole Miss, they beat Maryland, they played Auburn, which wasn't the greatest, but still, I don't give you too much grief for losing to Auburn. Lost to Texas A&M. Again, that's a 4 seed in the tournament, so not too much held against you. So I get it that Purdue had a lot of tough early games, and playing in Big Ten play is not easy. You have to be a darn good team to be routinely in the top of the Big Ten. It felt like a 4 seed was a little rich. Honestly, I felt more like number 4 Maryland should be in Wisconsin's spot. Maryland looked a lot more consistent throughout the season, and granted, it took some time for them to heat up. They didn't come into the season with a ton of high expectations, but it felt like instead of Wisconsin at 3, it should have been Maryland at number 3. Maybe Wisconsin slides into Purdue's number 4 spot. And truth be told, as much as it kills me, Purdue probably would have fit better as a 4, or excuse me, not as a 4, but as a 5 or maybe even a 6. But the way that the seeding worked out was that Michigan was a 5, Oregon was a 5. That one also felt very bizarre to me too. And similarly with Purdue, Oregon had a lot of really good early wins. They had wins against San Diego State, who truthfully that didn't age super well, but San Diego State's a bubble team. Alabama, Texas A&M, Maryland as well. So this Oregon team had good wins. They also had some pretty ugly losses. And they don't really strike as a team that is overwhelmingly good in one area. It's a little jack of all trades kind of feel out of Oregon. And the fact that they finished 8th in the Big Ten regular season, you beat Indiana in the Big Ten tournament. It's not that crazy. I don't know what Oregon did to reach a 5 seed, in all honesty. That one just felt like it was a little bit strange. In all honesty, if you want Big Ten teams in that slot, Illinois would have been a better fit at the 5 rather than Oregon. Now, maybe the committee saw Illinois as way too inconsistent, because Illinois could play like a top 10 team, and then they could play like they're bottom of the conference. A lot of young guys on the squad. That's understandable. But it just personally felt like the Big Ten seeding was very much out of whack. And again, it'd be worth diving into what the committee saw and what the committee looks for when assigning some of these teams. But it felt like they were just mailing it in before the tournament even began. And now there's some pretty brutal draws for these Big Ten teams. So in terms of Big Ten outlook, the only team I really see going far is Michigan State at number 2. Wisconsin could make a run. They could win 2 games possibly It depends if they go on to face BYU or Virginia Commonwealth. I don't see Wisconsin getting past Alabama. Now thinking about it, Wisconsin, they had to play a good amount of games in a short amount of time. So that's going to be a bit rough on their end. It'd be worth looking to see where the first game is played. I think Wisconsin, Montana might be Denver. But again, I'll cover some more of these a little bit later on. Just to kind of wrap things up too, because I've been yapping a good bit about basketball, but hey, it's March Madness. What can you do? A couple teams I felt were questionably seeded, along with Purdue, Oregon, Wisconsin to a degree. I feel like Louisville, number 8 Louisville, I don't know what happened with that. Coming in as an 8 seed after having a pretty impressive tear through the ACC tournament, they've only lost 2 games since mid-December. And those were Georgia Tech and Duke. Okay, you lose to Duke. I don't blame you that much. But 2 losses since mid-December. Now, to be fair, strength of schedule in your conference does matter. And the ACC this year is not really filled with juggernauts and world beaters. Duke, Clemson was a tough out. Georgia Tech was a pretty tough out. Wake Forest was a tough out as well. But when you're playing this year's Miami, Florida, Boston College, Virginia Tech, Virginia is having a down year too. I can understand why the committee would, I guess, penalize teams for the weaker strength of schedule. But for Louisville to be an 8 seed, play a pretty solid program in Creighton, and then whoever wins goes on to play Auburn, most likely. I doubt Auburn's going to lose round 1 no matter who gets through. That's a tough draw. Now, is the Louisville team going to respond to that pretty shafty seeding? I would hope so. Especially when you run through the ACC tournament, lose to Duke in the final round. I feel like Louisville did get shafted a bit. And Memphis is an interesting case too. Because as a mid-major, they are a really good team, in all honesty. And it took some diving around to look back on this Memphis squad. And at first I was thinking, why is Memphis here? Why are they a 5 seed? They seem like they ought to be like an 8 or a 9. But Memphis does have a pretty solid resume to them. They are 6-1 in quad 1 games, which is better. That's better than North Carolina. That's for sure. But they beat Missouri, San Francisco, who graded out as a top 60 team, UConn, Michigan State, a loss to Auburn. Again, not going to penalize you for that. Clemson and Ole Miss. Now, who else did Memphis beat? Well, not a whole lot of tough competition, but to get a 5 seed it struck me as bold. And this is kind of the first tournament I've really dove deeply into a lot of these teams and these conferences. I'm liking this Memphis squad, and they have a lot going for them. I don't know if it's typical for a team that's not in one of the power conferences to get this high of a seed. It'll be interesting because they get matched up with Colorado State, who they've been on fire lately. I think they won 10 straight or 11 straight games. And whoever wins between those two would go on to play either Maryland, number 4, or 13 Grand Canyon, who that's a really good mid-major too. That team has a lot of size, a lot of athleticism. Either of those teams could give Memphis a lot of problems. Whoever wins that, they have a shot to play either Florida, UConn, back-to-back defending champs, or possibly Oklahoma. So that's an interesting unit out of the West. And there are so many games to break down. The West itself is a bloodbath. There's just so much upset potential. And what can I say? There's nothing better than March. There's nothing better than March Madness. Now, hopefully it warms up here in this coming week here in the Midwest. I doubt that it will. But yeah, I guarantee that I'll be kicking back and enjoying round one and enjoying the absolute chaos that it comes. So if you enjoyed, thanks for watching. Enjoy these games. I will come back in a little bit to look at more potential upsets and a Final Four guess. I would say prediction, but when it comes to Final Four, it's all just a guessing game. So have a good one. Take care. Enjoy some ball.